Okay, great. Well, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen here. So just bear with me for a second. Hopefully you won't see my incredibly messy, cluttered desktop. Um, so I think maybe Benjamin or Elena can give me a thumbs up if we're okay. Great, awesome. So especially because this isn't a huge group. I hope that we can do this in a fairly intimate way. So I have 13 slides. It'll I think maybe take about a half an hour to get through them. If folks have questions along the way, I don't mind being interrupted at all. I think the ultimate point for me is to try to have a good conversation. So interruptions are welcome. And I just want to thank Animal Law Review for hosting this, and for everyone who is here. I noticed some names I recognize, and some folks who have some knowledge in this area as well, for sure. So that's great, and I think we can take advantage of that. I guess the last kind of preface note is, I'm painting in fairly broad brush strokes here. I am, going to talk about some legal trends, some policy trends, and just some kind of socioeconomic and political issues in the background. So we'll dive into some more technical legal detail here and there, but a lot of this is really sort of just introductory and context. So with that preface out of the way, let me dive right into it. Okay, and I guess if there are any tech issues or sound issues or anything, definitely interrupt me to let me know that. So my goal, more specifically, is threefold. So first, I want to paint a really basic picture of some of the positive legal trends that I perceive in Latin America regarding animal welfare and wildlife conservation. This, of course, could easily be, a week-long conference in and of itself. So it is, somewhat subjective in the sense that I'm honing in on things that I find particularly interesting, but I hope reasonably objective as well. Speaking of objectives, the second objective is to identify some structural challenges that I think do pose, consistent headwinds to achieving gains in the area of animal welfare and wildlife conservation. And I should say, on the term wildlife, I know within the wildlife conservation community, we use that term in different ways. A lot of times within the CITES context, for instance, we definitely mean to include plants and trees. Here, I'm generally actually using wildlife to mean wild animals. So that's kind of the focus in this presentation. And then, okay, to try to end on a more, I guess, positive note, and to throw out there some ideas that hopefully can and are being acted upon by NGOs and other interested actors and governments. I want to identify a few examples of what I see as low-hanging fruit. So things that can be done in terms of legal reform or policy reform that are available in several nations in the Latin American region. So there are opportunities that exist and that represent low-hanging fruit and that can be capitalized on, despite, I think, some of the structural challenges that I'll identify. So they're really good, to me, places to invest our energy. Okay, really zooming out now, okay? What are some positive legal trends in Latin America in this area of animal welfare and wildlife conservation? Well, first, I think it's important for us to take a longer historical view here and recognize that there's a pretty impressive history of progressive laws relating to the environment and wild fauna in Latin America. So, that's auspicious. So I kind of like to start off with this tidbit. Simón Bolívar issued a decree in 1825 to prohibit the intentional killing of vicuñas. And this is, I think, sometimes cited as one of the first animal protection laws in the region, at least in Latin America. And 1825, right? That's a way back. Now, full disclosure, to be honest, and as you might suspect, this was not motivated by animal welfare concerns, at least not primarily. The primary motivation, we should be clear, it was to protect the fiber industry. Vicuñas still to this day are harvested, exploited, managed. I guess you can pick your verb depending upon your point of view for their fiber, and that is done both legally and definitely illegally as well. But Simón Bolívar in 1825 issued this decree saying, well, hey, no intentional killing of vicuñas, thinking about, it was a sustainability motive. It was thinking about the fiber industry. But nevertheless, if we're going to chart out the history, I think, somewhat ahead of its time when we think about species protection or conservation laws. Now, zoom forward, and many folks may be familiar with the rights of nature movement, which is starting to take off in several parts of the world, some places more than others. And in Latin America, it has definitely, made a foothold. So in Ecuador's 2008 constitution, the rights of nature concept was enshrined in that constitution. I'm actually coincidentally doing a legal analysis related to Ecuador, and I've been digging into this a little bit more. And what's interesting to see is that, this rights of nature concept is actually beginning to be enforced in the courts in pretty meaningful ways. So far, the cases I've looked at tend to deal more with rivers. In Colombia, which actually does not have the rights of nature concept in its constitution, nevertheless, this legal concept was used to provide actually more than one now, set of legal rights to river systems in Colombia as well. The rights of nature as a constitutional concept also exists in Bolivia. And I should have mentioned at the beginning, actually, I'm speaking to everybody from Bolivia, coincidentally. So if I tend to give a whole bunch of Bolivian examples, you know why. They're close to hand for me. So that's impressive, right? And a fairly auspicious trend, I think, for nature writ large, and then more specifically for animals. Also, another pretty interesting movement in the region has been the creation of specialized environmental courts. So, this is something that, we don't see in the United States, and we don't see in many, many countries, but in places like Peru and Chile, and I could be wrong, but I believe there is a proposal under consideration in Mexico. I also am pretty darn sure that specialized environmental tribunals exist in Guatemala as well. And I wish I could be 100% on that. I just thinking back to some recent research I was doing that I'm pretty sure that is the case. So, again, if we think of environmental law as encompassing to some extent wildlife law, and then also to some extent maybe animal law, or at least they're sort of related bodies of law, the region really is taking off, at least formally, right? At least as written, in the way of doctrine and in the way of institutions. Okay, continuing on, and moving more, I guess, to the international space and kind of the diplomacy and the treaty space. Latin American countries have taken a lot of bold positions in international fora. So, for instance, the push to create the South Atlantic Whale Sanctuary within the International Whaling Commission. Now, that didn't succeed, but it was, I believe, universally, or if not universally, there may have been a holdout or two, overwhelmingly supported by the region of Latin America, through the countries that are members to the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling. Another example is the Lima Declaration on Illegal Wildlife Trade. So this is a soft law instrument, right? It's not binding. But in 2019, October 2019, approximately 21 countries from the Latin American region met through their delegates in Lima to hammer out this declaration on illegal wildlife trade. And several conclusions, concrete conclusions and meaningful conclusions were arrived at that all of the delegates signed off on and supported. So examples include a commitment to treat wildlife crime as serious crime. And that has some technical implications, for instance, under the UN Treaty on Organized Crime, but also just the sort of like atmospheric, I think, or kind of policy directive implications, right? We're going to treat this as serious crime. We're going to take this seriously. It's going to be given higher priority, et cetera. A recognition of the growing threat of e-commerce and internet sales related to wildlife. Recognizing the need for greater cross-border cooperation, and about 20 or so similar points. Now, some of these line items, you might say, they're a little bit squishy. I'd like to see a little more specificity. But in the area of international legal instruments, the conclusions and the sort of adopted recommendations are actually pretty specific. And yes, it is a soft law instrument. It's not legally binding, but nevertheless, all the countries getting together and saying, hey, we support this, is meaningful. And actually, I would dare say that soft law instruments of this nature are taken more seriously in Latin America than they are, at least in the United States, right? So international law in general is I think, weightier in the region, as it is around the world, I would say, compared to the United States. So the point is important development there. And then a generally progressive voting record at CITES and CMS. It's I don't mean to say across the board, Latin American countries are universally always supporting new decisions to list species or to uplist species, or, supporting progressive resolutions, but it's a pretty solid voting record if you're looking for, okay, what countries are supporting the more progressive, conservation-oriented outcomes. And this text bomb I just threw on you, I think is kind of an important point as well. And here, some of these positions are probably debatable, right? And I encourage folks to push back. But I think that from what I've seen in the region, animal welfare and conservation are frequently not seen as ideological issues. Now, there's a big caveat there, right? I think that's the case with respect to companion animals, and I think that's the case with respect to wild animals. If we talk about farmed animals, then, ideology or sort of party politics it does make a difference. But as I guess, some evidence, anecdotal perhaps, but nevertheless, I think pretty powerful in its place. The Bolsonaro administration, widely considered to be a very right-leaning, conservative, right-leaning administration in the region, right? The Trump of the tropics, as some have dubbed him. His administration pushed also for the South Atlantic whale sanctuary at the 2018 IWC meeting, and voted to include oceanic white-tipped sharks in Appendix 1 of CMS, and Appendix 1 CMS species. The obligation there is to prohibit take of those species. So I just mentioned that because I think that a lot of us, I think, who grew up in the United States are sort of hardwired or trained or, habituated to think, well, on the right, they're going to probably also oppose, progressive environmental and wildlife or even animal welfare policies. And it's not necessarily the case. Now, again, big exception if we talk about farmed animals. But if I could just drill down a little bit more on this, I actually think the exception needs some explanation, because while governments on the right in Latin America, right, if we can use this very simplistic dichotomy of left and right, but let's say governments on the right in Latin America, if, within their national economies, things like the cattle industry are big, they're going to support that gung-ho. It's definitely not a guarantee that, in comes a left administration and they're going to somehow support that less or try to curb that. Unfortunately, the extractive nature of Latin American economies in many cases means that governments on the left and the right, if the economics are there, are going to support that. And that actually goes, I think, perfectly with the next slide. Maybe I anticipated it a little bit. No, I didn't. We're going to come back to that point I just made. Apologies. Okay, so let's talk about some structural challenges then. I kind of just hinted at one. But let's start with this baseline point. The region does suffer from rule of law challenges. There is, in many cases, and it varies from country to country for sure, quite a bit, but there is a significant disconnect between the law as written, what the Constitution says, what specific statutes say, what regulations say, and then the law as applied. And that just, has really untold consequences, wide-ranging consequences for every single, subject matter that the law touches. People start disbelieving in the power of law. Oh yeah, okay, here's another law. Yeah, that's really going to change things. People start just disobeying the law, right? Because they know, well, yeah, the law says I'm going to get in trouble, but I know there's a way around it. At least, if I have money and connections. So it's a problem. And here's a little bit of data on this point. So the World Justice Project does this rule of law index, and surveys, most countries in the world to collect data on rule of law. And they have various different metrics and variables that they analyze. But it's a pretty good system, I think. And as you can see, this is the Latin American and Caribbean scores. Now you have countries on the left, especially the upper left, that actually score, reasonably well. Uruguay, for instance, clocks in at global rank 23 out of 126 is its rule of law index score. That's pretty impressive. But all these countries on the right, so basically half of the region are performing in the bottom half of the world, right? So they're below the 50% mark. And as you can see, a lot of those countries are big, important countries, if you will. Brazil is just kind of on the cusp. It's actually on the left, but we have countries like Mexico, many Central American countries, Ecuador, Peru is in there, Colombia, Bolivia, etc. So I don't want to belabor the point more, but there's the data. Now, a few more ways while I populate this screen that rule of law challenges can manifest themselves. Because we talk about it's a weak rule of law. What's that mean? Well, in Latin America, I think it means corruption is an issue, right? Whether that's bribing folks to get a permit, an export permit maybe that shouldn't be received to export a certain specimen, whether that's bribing someone to get out of getting in trouble, right, being prosecuted or something if they've been detected, on and on and on, paying folks off to look the other way, etc. Another issue, right, is politicized courts and prosecutors. Now, this doesn't necessarily affect as much animal welfare and wildlife conservation concerns. The bigger, more visible problem is, well, while a certain party is in the government, folks associated with that party, oftentimes have sort of free reign to break a lot of laws. And then in comes a new administration, and then there's, persecution of anybody associated with that past government. That's a common trend. I don't think it affects as much in this specific subject matter, but it's there in the background. It does affect wildlife conservation prosecution efforts in the sense that courts, are just not respected as neutral kind of calling ball and strike actors. Courts are seen as less than fully legitimate often in the region. There's lack of training and competence in some cases, right? Plenty of reasons for that. One reason is there's a lot of high turnover, especially in prosecution offices. Prosecutors, come in and go out. Well, that erodes the ability of institutional memory, of institutional learning growth, etc. People are, okay, I've got to learn this new area of law again, right? You don't get the build up over time. And then just plain old insufficient resources, lack of money, lack of courts, lack of prosecutors, insufficient rangers to patrol parks. They don't have the vehicles, or if they have them, they don't have the gasoline. Actually, somebody here before we got started mentioned that I used to work for Sea Shepherd, and that's true. And I can let you know that Sea Shepherd has been in the past approached for not only boats coming in, but even for things like gasoline. Now, the organization didn't do that, but I mentioned that as an anecdote to show the lack of resources, right? Okay. This is the point I kind of anticipated in some earlier, in my earlier comments regarding extractive industries and how that plays out politically or doesn't really, in terms of kind of an ideological distinction. Latin American countries still, it's changing. It is changing. But there is a lot of economic reliance on extractive economies. Timber, minerals, natural gas, fish, you name it. And there's a pie chart that's probably difficult to read, but that kind of shows silver mining output by country in 2016. And that's just one commodity, one mineral, but many of those countries that dominate that output market, right, are Latin American countries. In Peru, to provide another example, the fishing industry is huge. The marine fishing industry, in particular, the anchovy industry, it's the largest single fishery in the world. It's enormous, and most of that, by the way, is not going for direct human consumption. It's going to be ground up into fish meal and fish oil to then be served as animal feed, as nutrients for crops as well. Its ultimate destination is kind of doubly sad. Timber, of course, is huge. And let's go to the next slide, which relates to this. We don't, I think, always think of, the livestock industry as part of the extractive economy, right? In the sense that, cattle are not growing the same way that trees are growing on the ground, or cattle are not like, copper that's pulled out of a mountain. But it is similar in the sense that it's very much relying on, the available natural resources, land, grazing land, and then, commodity crops like soy. And a lot of the money that comes from this is not necessarily going to the producers or the producing countries, right? The value chain as cattle gets exported, more value, in monetary terms, so just in monetary terms, is added on. And it's exploding. It's exploding down here. So world beef exports by country, this is from 2012. So actually, outdated. Brazil is in 2012 number 3, Uruguay 8, Argentina 9, Mexico 10. So out of the top 10 world beef exports, right, world beef exporting countries, 4 of them are in Latin America. And again, I don't have a whole bunch of empirical data at my hands to give this to give to you on this, but I can definitely say that this industry is growing big time here in Bolivia. And it's just one country, but I think it's representative of a broader trend. Deals were recently struck to provide beef to China. So, direct exports from Bolivia to China for beef. Russia as well. I'm not sure of the market flow to the United States, but the Amazon and the dry rainforest, the Chaco area is just getting crushed by soy plantation and cattle grazing. It's expanding at a really rapid rate. And I should say, and this goes back to my kind of ideology point, that was the case under a left-leaning, self-described socialist government. Absolutely the case. Big-time expansion of the cattle industry. It was also the case under a right-leaning transition government that had the reins here in Bolivia last year, and it's going to be the case again under the self-described, leftist government. So I think it's just worth knowing so that we don't necessarily fool ourselves into thinking, oh, it's a left government, therefore that implies X, Y, and Z environmental or animal policies, and oh, it's a right, so it implies X, Y, or Z. We got to look beyond those distinctions. Okay. I should hurry up here because I want to provide time for back and forth. Another structural challenge is lack of transparency. And what I mean by that is access to government information, to government records, the ability of common citizens to know what their government is doing, and that's so important in wildlife work, just like in any other sector. You need to know, okay, what permits is the government granting, right? What authorizations or concessions, is the government granting to for logging? What kind of enforcement efforts actually are taking place? A lot of that we know in the States. You can get a lot of really valuable information through FOIA requests, right? Freedom of Information Act requests. Well, this banner here, another Bolivia example, sorry, says Bolivia among the few countries that does not in the region that does not have an access to information law. And anecdotally, I have a relative who was trying to get some public information and had to drive all the way to the national capital and dig through records there in an office, not allowed to photocopy at all. So many countries in the region are doing better. I'm going to highlight a treaty actually that is coming down the pike on this issue in the region. So there's some positive signs, but it's still an issue. This is another big one. Barriers to holding the government accountable. In the public interest law field in the United States, I think it's fair to say the idea of suing the government, right, and holding the government or a government agency to account is very familiar and is something that, many of us see as really, really important to making progress on these issues. So, and again, this is going to vary from country to country, but, I've had conversations over the years with Latin American environmental and wildlife lawyers on this issue. And one of the responses you can see there in Spanish was, here, they just throw you in jail. In other words, this person was saying, well, if you try to sue the government here, and this was in Bolivia, okay, so, I'm not saying that would be the case in every country, right? It wouldn't be. But, oh, no, you try to sue the government here, like, oh, basically bring a suit against a government agency. No, they're gonna throw you in jail. Now, the person was exaggerating a little bit, but it's definitely a very different climate and a very different culture. You can't just willy-nilly, I think it's fair to say, in many countries in Latin America, aggressively sue the government the way you can in the United States. And the next point goes in line with that. There's a lot of intimidation of environmental activists and even prosecutors, right? State employees who go too far. And many folks may have seen the headlines, over the years. But Latin America has become a pretty deadly place for folks opposing, big projects, hydroelectric projects, forestry concessions, things of that nature. So that's another, structural, persistent challenge. Okay, now let's go to the low-hanging fruit. And again, I should say, what I'm trying to do here is point out a few examples, just a few, of I think, sort of positive opportunities, right, that seem reachable and would make a decent difference, like would give us a pretty good return on the investment, if you will, would make a pretty good difference for wildlife in the region. So one is moving from an administrative default to a penal default. And, what I mean by that is, sorry, getting ahead of myself. What I mean by that is, in Latin America, I think it's fair to say that the administrative sanctions, administrative investigation, administrative citation, and administrative sanctions tend to be the default for wildlife crimes and environmental crimes. They're, in fact, not necessarily given criminal treatment, even though they frequently qualify for criminal treatment. And there are reasons for that. Sometimes the administrative entity is a bit disconnected from the prosecutorial service. Frequently, in order for a prosecution to happen, For these kinds of crimes in Latin America, you need an administrative report that is then passed, because the administrative report actually establishes an element of the crime. Oh, there was illegal taking of a species. Well, the illegality of it is based upon sort of the administrative criteria. So there's some reasons for this. But moving from administrative default to a penal default, and it can just be a default, right? You don't always want to throw the book at everybody every time. In my opinion, I think it's important that prosecutors and other state actors, right, distinguish between cases. I mean, there are certain cases that absolutely deserve very harsh treatment, you know, to set an example, you know, for retribution, go down your kind of classic list of criminal punishment rationales. But then there are other cases where, okay, somebody had a license to fish and it expired, you know, a day ago. You probably don't want to put that person away for life, right? So anyway, reframing crimes against wildlife as organized crime. This is something that is absolutely getting some traction, at least in some countries in the region. So Peru has a wildlife, an organized crime law. And this organized crime law basically lists a series of predicate crimes, things like money laundering, things like drug dealing and related activity, tax evasion, smuggling. And if one of those predicate crimes is at issue in a case, then it can be treated as an organized crime, which gives investigators and prosecutors a lot of important tools, like the ability to wiretap, right? The ability to use undercover agents, more time to develop an investigation. So some important, you know, tools there to actually build a complex case. And Peru already treats illegal logging and illegal mining as valid predicate crimes for purposes of that organized crime law. And there's a bill pending to include illegal fishing and wildlife trafficking, trafficking of fauna, and a few other related crimes within that rubric. So that's going to help a lot, because unfortunately, without some of those complex and sophisticated investigative tools, it's really hard to put together a comprehensive prosecution that moves up the criminal food chain, right? That gets at the people who are really making the money and calling the shots in some cases. Okay, another example is thinking about remedies and expanding remedies or expanding use of existing remedies. And often it's the latter. Often the laws provide the remedies that we want. It's just the use of them is sometimes a little bit lacking. So let me give an example. This vessel you see here, the Fu Wan Wu Lang 999, was a Chinese flagged vessel. And some folks may be familiar with this case. It was detected crossing through Galapagos Marine Reserve with approximately 6,000 sharks on board. Some of those sharks were CITES listed species, hammerheads in particular, I think some silky sharks as well. But what's interesting, and maybe you can tell by the shape of this vessel, it's not a fishing vessel in the classic sense of, you know, throwing lines out or nets out and catching sharks. This is a refrigerated transport vessel. So other boats caught the sharks. And where did they catch the sharks? This is interesting. Not in waters subject to Ecuador's jurisdiction. They caught them, the evidence suggests, in the high seas, in international waters. Then they transshipped those sharks to this vessel, and then this vessel passed through the Galapagos Marine Reserve. All right, well, how do you build a prosecution, or how do you prosecute this vessel, the captain, the owner, etc.? Because it didn't actually take sharks from Ecuadorian waters, right, or water subject to Ecuadorian jurisdiction. Well, in Ecuador, in the Galapagos Marine Reserve, it is illegal to possess sharks on board a vessel. So, and that's a pretty actually aggressive approach to criminal wildlife law. So the prosecution was primarily for possession and transportation of these sharks. Doesn't matter that they came from the high seas. And this brings us to the remedy. So the prosecution was a success. And, got ahead of myself. The Ecuadorian courts affirmed the permanent forfeiture of this vessel as an instrument of crime. So just like, you know, we can imagine somebody transporting drugs in a car, you know, depending upon the jurisdiction, that car might be subject to permanent forfeiture because it was used as an instrument of crime, right? In addition to any jail time or any financial penalties, you also lose the car. Well, here, that entire vessel, and it's huge, and you know, Chinese flagged, and which makes a difference from the political perspective. I mean, Ecuador has a lot of trade going on with China, but nevertheless, made the decision to have that forfeited permanently. You know, that's a blow. That's a blow. If organized illegal fishing syndicates start thinking, wow, we could, you know, not only have, you know, some throwaway captain go to jail and okay, we got to pay a fine, but we lose, you know, these core instruments. That'll make folks think twice. And then of course, going after the proceeds of crime, right? So forfeiture of proceeds of crime, and that requires sophisticated financial investigation. And you do that by, for instance, taking advantage of organized crime laws so that you can, you know, see otherwise confidential bank records. A lot of times that stuff is protected. So you can do wiretaps, use undercover agents, etc. You figure out how much money has been earned off of all this, and then you forfeit that. Ultimately, these are crimes, you know, motivated by the prospect of economic gain, right? So you have to attack that. Okay, I'm gonna try to hurry up a little bit. Another piece of low-hanging fruit, at least in some countries, is ensuring comprehensive endangered or protected species lists. This is just an example here, but in Peru, the red list, they call it the red list of wildlife, of protected wildlife, does not include, just categorically, marine species. They're just not included. Another agency regulates that, and they're just not part of that. And actually, excuse me, in the legislation, they're just definitionally not counted as wildlife. The Center for Animal Law Studies, as folks may know, has started to do more on sort of aquatic animal law. And this kind of relates to that, because in many countries, in Latin America and otherwise, aquatic species are given different treatment. Like fish is this, you know, that's a resource, right? That's a little bit different. So anyway, there's work to be done there. Going back to my access to information point, so there's a treaty called the Acuerdo de Escazú, and it's about access to justice, access to information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice in environmental matters. So suite of issues, but one thing it would do would be to obligate parties to have, you know, legit FOIA-like laws. And that would go a long way, I think, if properly implemented, to bring some more transparency. And it's on its way. Last checked, we were missing one country. Somebody in the audience may be able to correct me here if that one country ratification has come through, but one more ratification for this to go into force for the countries that have ratified. So I think we're at 10 now, and I think 11 are required. So it's coming, like it's almost a certainty. Well, I'm knocking on wood, but okay. we're almost there. Actually, is my last point. Lacey Act like legislation is something that I think could be really powerful in the region. So the Lacey Act, the U.S. Lacey Act, has a lot of interesting features. One feature that I think is the most promising, at least when we're thinking about Latin America, is that it makes it a federal offense to import wildlife taken from a foreign country in violation of that country's laws. So, as an example, because that's kind of maybe a little esoteric. So let's imagine a U.S. citizen illegally captures a toucan barbet while vacationing in Ecuador. Okay, they bring the bird back to the United States. Well, this species is not listed on the under the ESA. It's not listed in CITES except for an Appendix 3 listing in Colombia. For non-CITES folks, don't worry about that. It doesn't really matter too much. But here's the kicker. If this bird is protected in Ecuador, and in my hypothetical, it is, right? This was illegally taken, whether that means without a permit, whether that means this is a 100% protected species. This person took it illegally and tried to take it back to the United States. Well, with the Lacey Act, that person now is subject to prosecution. Why? Because they tried to bring back wildlife that they took in violation of another country's, in this case, Ecuador's law. So I tend to call this, I don't know if this term's going to catch on, probably won't, but I like to call this structural legal collaboration, because we can also think of sort of operative legal collaboration, where two countries are working together on a case to sort of investigate and mutually support each other with investigation. But here it's at the structural level. One country is saying, you know what, we've got a law, the Lacey Act, that's basically going to allow us to, if you think about it in general terms, enforce your law in our country. Now you could cast it a little bit different, but that's essentially what's happening. We got your back, right? This person broke your law. They took this bird illegally. When they get back to the United States, we're going to say that they violated our law too, even though we don't have any law, that specifically protects this species, as such. So Lacey Act legislation is not common in Latin America. There's a conversation going on about sovereignty, like, well, what is that somehow, is that like extraterritorial jurisdiction? Are we somehow, not respecting other countries' sovereignty? And I think that's, kind of a conversation that needs to happen. And ultimately, I'd like to be able to help convince folks that no, it's not, it doesn't offend any kind of sovereignty principles. It's just good structural collaboration and cooperation. And I think the fact that there already is a lot of strong regional cooperation in so many other areas, common language as well, save for Brazil, makes Lacey Act like laws kind of a natural fit for the region. So, conclusion. I think it's pretty basic where I'm going with this. There are several elements in Latin America, trends that are favorable to progress in the fight to improve protections for animals. There are a lot of reasons to feel good about this region as a place where progress can be made, right? On the other hand, we do have some of these structural features that create headwinds, that create sort of persistent stumbling blocks, things that are gonna, frustrate some of those efforts. So I guess for me, the upshot of all this is, well, let's look for the low-hanging fruit then. Let's look for the things that we can do despite those structural issues, or where maybe those structural issues aren't as strongly implicated, and let's focus our energy there, because obviously we all have limited energy, limited resources. You probably have limited attention spans. So I'm going to end it there, and hopefully there's still some time for us to have a conversation. So I'll stop screen sharing now, I think. If I can figure out how to do that. In show. Okay.
I think you might still be screen sharing. There should be, it's a bar
Oh,
at the
I'm
top,
sorry.
maybe. There you
Yes.
go.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. No, I was really excited about your presentation, and I absolutely loved it. I had two links that I'll put in the chat that were just sort of updated about agriculture production that you mentioned, and they totally support what you were saying.
Awesome. That's great. Yes, new data is always welcome.
And at this point, if anybody has any questions, feel free to just unmute yourself, or if it's easier, to put any questions that you might have in the chat.
Or comments or observations, or frankly, I disagree with you, because I know I see a couple of people who I know have some knowledge in this area, some expertise, some colleagues. So that is welcome as well.
I have a question, or a comment more than a question. And as you were talking, I was hearing a lot of parallels with what I've heard when I've been in African, in African countries. If you're too good as a prosecutor, you may end up dead. The lack of enforcement of what seems like good laws, although frankly, there's also parallels here in the United States where there are laws that sound great until you realize that they're simply not being enforced. It goes on, even in Europe, where they've got some great directives in the EU for farmed animals. Again, the enforcement is where they fall down. Got any thoughts about, how does one, that's where the pedal meets the metal,
Yeah. So I have, I think, a couple of thoughts. So one thought I have is, and here people may disagree with me. I encourage that. I think there's, generally speaking, enough law on the books in Latin America. There are certain kind of gaps, like I talked about. Hey, wouldn't it be great to have some Lacey Act legislation and some sort of certain targeted areas? But in general, the problem in the region is not a lack of law, a lack of kind of, that's just a regulatory vacuum. I think the bigger problem is enforcement. I think a lot of times, unfortunately, more and more laws churned out all the time. I mean, it's an incredibly legislative rich region. It's really hard to map out the law. You get new laws all the time, new directives, new regulations. It's actually too much of a good thing. And I think it does contribute to this atmosphere where people think, well, really, like, it somehow degrades the law overall, right? Like, okay, here's another law and it's not enforced. So I think the first thing is, let's kind of push the brakes on that a little bit. Like, let's really think about, do we need new laws, right? In terms of enforcement, I've thought about this so much. Like, wouldn't it be great to have like an active citizen suit kind of mechanism and culture? In theory, that could help a lot for enforcement. I think more thought needs to be given to that. There is a lack of financial resources. Maybe you can do things for incentives. Like, I know here, I was talking to some folks here in Bolivia about how police are promoted, and they get points for basically making cases, right, that go on to successful prosecution, and they are, whether it's a formal system or not, they're rewarded for the murder cases, the drug trafficking cases, right? So, like, how do you create incentives for all of those actors to say, well, wait, these are serious cases that are worth my effort as well. I'm not giving you any answers, but I think you're absolutely right. That's where our thinking needs to be.
I actually wanted to comment like, hi, Nick, my name is Lorna. I am in Bolivia right now in La Paz.
No idea. Okay.
Yeah, I think they mentioned you, and I didn't have the pleasure of meeting you while I was there at Lewis and Clark, and I got the LLM in animal law.
Okay,
but
great.
I appreciate a lot like what you were talking about, and I totally like. There's a lot of points that I think you made that are very valid, and I think I appreciate a lot that you mentioned this left and right thing, because I think that is a big like danger right now, because I think Latin America is starting to go into this like left versus right, and getting this issue of animal protection being very political. So it wasn't politically driven, but I think it's increasingly politically driven. And I think now we have that discussion of left and right, and this perception, for example, in the world, like, for example, last government of Evo Morales and the left, he was even praised as a protector of Mother Earth while he was destroying everything. So I think that is very dangerous, and I think that is something that has to go out to the world. Like, it's not an issue of left, right, and it's like you have these very toxic people that are like playing on these like political discourses and trying to make people believe that they. So yeah, I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, well, I hope we can meet in person sometime, maybe after COVID settles down. I'm in Cochabamba, so we're not,
great.
Yeah.
You're not that far.
Not too far.
Hello. I'm sorry. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi. I'm also in Cochabamba, by the way, and I really appreciate your comments about Bolivia. I had another view. I don't really know a lot of how like the movements here right now about like animal or wild animals, sort of like protectors or NGOs or things like that. But something that I have observed, it's that I think there's more sort of like activists or protests, or I don't know, like outrage, let's say, about environmental things in Bolivia, like let's say the forests or waters that are contaminated, right? And I haven't seen very much like a separate movement just for animals. I have seen it's mostly like just in general the environment. And I don't know, like maybe if that could ever happen, something like that would be just dedicated for animals. And even if it's just wild animals, because like you said, there's not much thought put on farmed animals. And I don't know how can that change, but at least for some part, like I haven't seen too much like people stressing out like animal rights, even if it's just for wildlife. But maybe you know more about that. I haven't heard it as much. It's not something that went out in the news, or march, like people when they go march from one place to another. I haven't seen any sort of like focus just on animals versus the environment, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair observation, from what I've seen in Bolivia specifically. I feel like, and Joyce and others may have some thoughts on this, but I feel like perhaps there is I don't know if I want to call it a natural progression, but a progression that sometimes happens where, consciousness is developed around the environment, and then maybe and sort of, well, the environment includes all that stuff. It's the forest, it's the trees, it's the animals, well, maybe it's not the farmed animals, so let's think about that later. But it starts there, and then I think it begins to get more sophisticated, right? And can grow from there. I mean, I know over the US summer, I guess over our winter, there was the case in Oruro with what was the cat? It was some sort of wild feline. I forget, like a bobcat-ish.
And the jaguars or what?
Well, not the jaguar. Well, the jaguars. Yeah, I mean that's a case where I think the jaguar fang case involving the Chinese citizens.
It was a
Mhm.
sorrow that lived with a family with it. It was raised with dogs and everything.
Yeah, so
Oh
like
that's for yeah, the fox.
this was a fox that was,
Antonio, I think it was. I thought it was the name. Yeah.
yeah, and it was being held in captivity in a person's house, and there was this big controversy, of course, about well, it's our pet, and so that to me I saw as a positive sign that people were starting to say like, no, I mean, there were a lot of people I think that did respond to that story and thought, well, wait a second, that's a wild animal, like it deserves to be in the wild. And you all would know better than I do, but I feel like the tradition of and the culture in some places, I guess, of keeping like parrots and things like that, I feel like that's starting to maybe not go away. But like there's a little bit more consciousness around that, I feel like, in recent years.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. The only thing that like I don't know if like people, I feel like people make uh I think the environment is important and you have to care for it. And there's a lot of how can I say, indigenous views about uh deities and spirits and things like that. And I think that should be also appreciated. But um I don't know if people make the connection that animals probably have more how can I say, like this sort of sentience or like capacity to suffer versus like also other things. So I wish there would be more awareness also about the animals in that regard. But I haven't seen that much. I have seen a lot of people worry so much about, let's say, protecting mountains or trees, and I love that. But I haven't, like, it's like animals. It's like not really thought about that. It's like just another tree would be beside it, and it's like I haven't seen too much of that.
Yeah. Are there other questions or thoughts? I could go on forever. So it's late for us in Bolivia, but okay, Pauline's got a question. Hey, Pauline, nice to see you on here. Oh, but I don't know if we can hear you. Your mic isn't working. Do you want to try to type it? Okay. So while Pauline is typing her question, we could also um, have another question or comment if. Oh, okay, here we go. Okay, let me read this. Have you heard of any, yeah, I don't know how, something you, so, Paulin, we should talk. Yeah, so I've just had kind of side conversation. So sorry, I don't know if everyone can read this question. I'll read it out loud. I liked your example of the region copying something similar to the Lacey Act. Have you heard of any countries attempting to do this? And if not, how would you go about implementing this? Is this something that you would think countries would be willing to promote in the next Americas conference? So, and my first response was, Paulin, let's talk more about this. I think that it's something that seems doable. I've just had kind of side conversations here and there with a couple of prosecutors and different folks at different regional conferences. And, the question I always start with is like, okay, hey, is there, and I'll give like a hypothetical situation. Is there a law that would deal with this, essentially provide kind of Lacey Act kind of response? And in my very informal survey, it's always been like, oh, no, there's nothing like that. So it is possible that there is a country or two in the region that has something like this. So I'd like to do some research on that to make sure I'm right in my impression. I know it's not common overall in the region. I just don't know if there's, an example or two where something like this does exist. But then these conversations go to like, oh yeah, well, that'd be interesting, but like, can that be done under international law? Like, isn't that like somehow, violating extraterritorial principles of non-application of a country's law, in another jurisdiction? And then I say, well, no, because you're still, there is an act that's occurring in your jurisdiction, right? Bringing the wildlife back that was illegally sourced. Yes, part of the conduct took place in another country, but there's territorial jurisdiction. So it's, really not a problem from that perspective. So yeah, I just think it's a pretty, easy, right? Nothing is easy, but like, it seems feasible to me. And it seems like, I don't see why countries would really resist it. I can't think of a good, sort of, oh, there's an economic incentive that you're not considering. There's their interests at play. Like, I just don't see those kind of like opposing interests. So anyway, yeah, I think it's something that we should think about and really maybe should, develop a concerted push on. So if you want to talk more about this offline, I would be happy to do that.
Nick, unless anybody else has, I don't see anybody. Okay. Speak, Joyce. What do you think of as the most pressing wildlife concerns and issues? You can talk about Bolivia or Latin America in general.
Well, wild animals.
Yeah.
Talking wild animals. Yeah.
Because you could go on forever if you want to go to each classification. So let's just talk wild.
Yeah, right. So the shark fin trade is pretty bad in the region. As a source region. There was a recent study, I forget if it was in Nature or Science, but where DNA testing had been done on Hong Kong markets. And, I forget the exact percentage, but a massive quantity of these fins were coming from the Eastern Tropical Pacific. So, off the coast of Central America and Colombia and Ecuador. A lot are coming from the Caribbean as well. There's actually a lot of, the fins get shipped, primarily to Asia. there is actually pretty strong meat consumption in some countries in Latin America. Brazil consumes a lot of shark meat. Peru does as well. It's often sold under, names that there's an attempt to deceive a little bit there sometimes in the markets. And as apex predators, it's a real problem. And we know a lot of shark species are just, doing really, really bad. Some of these are CITES listed species. Some of them are not, but probably should be. So that the bird trade, is a really big problem as well. And a lot of that, actually, a fair amount, is for domestic markets. So it's I think we have this idea that, in biodiverse rich countries in Latin America, in Africa, I know less about Africa, but in Latin America, there's actually a lot of internal illegal wildlife trade, right? Where it's snatched out of, birds snatched out of a jungle and it's going to the, to the city, but it's staying within the same country. So yeah, reptiles, turtles, I guess those would be some of the bigger. I mean, jaguars have been, definitely in the spotlight lately because fangs are being harvested, and a lot of times going to Asian markets.
Fangs are used for what?
So it's interesting. So the one explanation is that it's sold as American tiger in Asian markets, and the idea being that as tiger becomes scarcer there, the jaguar teeth are substituting.
American tiger?
Yeah, American tiger.
As if there are tigers in America?
Well, I guess the America is like, it's just this bit, right? But I mean, so there have been some really high profile cases, but I just don't know. I mean, just because there are high profile cases doesn't mean it's like the, most threatened taxa, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, Paul. Okay, look, there we go. Right. It appears.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions? Or I don't want to keep folks late. I guess we've gone over, but like for me, this is great. But I'm happy for us to shut it down as well if folks want to get on with their evening. Up to the group.
And if people have any questions that they think of after the fact, you can always feel free to email the EIC account and we can sort of forward those questions on and connect folks. Or Professor Fromherz, if you have an email address that people can reach you at or anything like that. I know sometimes things need to simmer before people can form their questions, if that's the case.
Yeah, I just dropped it there in the chat. So hopefully folks can copy that down if they want to. Yeah. I'm super happy to receive questions, talk more with people. I love talking about this stuff. So
Thank you again so much. This was awesome. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thanks everybody for coming. Really, I'm so glad that you spend some of your Friday afternoon and evening talking about this. So thanks to you.
Have a great evening, everyone.
Enjoy the weekends. Take care, everybody.